I did a webinar with the African Institute of Art from the Smithsonian. This is just going to be a video sharing some of the nuggets, and some of the chats within it. I hope you really enjoy it, and to all of you who continue to watch the videos, to like, to comment, to subscribe, I really would encourage you to keep on doing it and to keep on sharing. I appreciate all of your interaction. I appreciate all of your feedback in shaping the channel. He is an initiated Sangoma with 7 years as practicing. He's a diviner, a medium, and a channeler. He helps people reconnect people to their ancestry, genealogy, and identity. And he's a holistic health and wellness practitioner in Inyanga. He's an ethnomedicine practitioner, an alchemist, and a gobela. He is also a seer. He is also often featured on radio and television and print, as well as contributing to various academic discourses and programs, speaking to African indigenous knowledge systems and Ungoma. Welcome. Can you just tell us briefly who you are and how long you've practiced your faiths? Thokoza, I'm Ukuthwasa by birth, but that person died and was reborn on the 6th of July in 2014 when I initiated as Sangoma. So the journey of becoming Sangoma is one that has to do with the calling. It's not a vocation that you can pick up by interest or by chance. It is something that is inherently encoded in your DNA, much like we inherit, certain traits from our ancestors, both character traits and physical traits. It would be said to be part of the blood pathologies that run with our indigenous practices and our indigenous expression. So within that, practicing as a Sangoma means that basically I'm a person who acts firstly as a historian, because in order to be an indigenous knowledge practitioner, you must understand the cosmology as a whole of the people. So as Isangoma, we act as historians and as libraries, able to tap into the knowledge that is in this realm or in this world, which means all of the knowledge that we've collected as humanity, but also with the ability to tether then into the spiritual realm, into the realms where then there's also those records that exist through those that have walked before, through sort of certain energetic signatures which are left by lived experience. Because even in quantum science, it's understood that energy never dies, energy always remains. So part and parcel of what we do as Sangomas is that we're able to understand the relation, to tap into certain energetic vibrations, to open up those orifices of history that connect you to your identity, to your lineage, to your history, which is important around self-actualizing on a mind, body, spirit level. On a secondary level, to be a Sangoma basically is then also to be somebody who's a community leader. Being a community leader means that you must embody the principles of the cosmology within you're born from. As Umungoma, who is a Sangoma, who comes from Abantu Base Africa, our great belief is Ubuntu, the fact that I am because you are. My humanity begins when I recognize your humanity. So there's a lot of social activism and awareness that is enshrined in how it is that you live, which is around cultivating a space of inclusivity, because that is what Ubuntu is about. When we say that I am because you are, it means everyone is valid and everyone has a space under the African sun and under this world. And we work then in the space then in what in modernity would be understood maybe as a counselor, where you mediate and you bring in interventions where there's struggles from maybe a personal level, on an individual level, on a familial level, on a communal level in your community, and how it is that we can work from a point of restoration, because we believe in indigenous knowledge system in restorative means and not necessarily sort of palliative means. And the third, I think, and most important tier of being Sangoma for me is the fact that you are a healer. And that word is one that
I will not define as to what does it mean to be a healer. Anything that we do that is a positive or even sometimes a negative experience to someone can be a catalyst for someone's healing, whether it's from a cognitive point of view where you come in with a certain provocation to a thought system or an idea or an ideology that's been held, and you destroy that so that the person can maybe break away from, if they're misogynistic, patriarchal, heteronormative sort of things which limit their ability to progress in the modern world, because we are cultivating a more inclusive society. So you would heal that aspect of them. Within the body, if there are ailments that have to do with sort of headaches or any sort of physiological ailments, you would also facilitate healing on that level. When it comes to the emotive level also, we hold space for counseling and for therapeutic healing to be able to deal with intergenerational transference and intergenerational trauma. When we say we work with the ancestral, we go into understanding the pathologies beyond just what it gives us in terms of our traits and our characters and certain ailments, but going into also the characteristics and the behaviors and the traumas that we have inherited from our ancestors, and how it is that in acknowledging them, in being aware of them, we can be able to heal that intergenerational wound that may then be something that afflicts a whole familial lineage. When we go into the spiritual, whether it's from a religious perspective or from just a seeking perspective, we are spiritual beings inherently having a human experience. So we give expression to people to be able to connect with their specific vibration or code or expression of spirituality. So there is no set modality. If your modality or your choice of preference is through Christianity or that religious mode, it's around how do you move from a religious perspective, which is about systems and control, to then being Christian within a spiritual perspective, which is then about understanding the interconnectedness of everything and the divinity within everyone. If you're taking it from an Eastern mysticism perspective, how do you then incorporate the understanding of Eastern mystic systems such as Buddhism and Taoism into growing your spirituality? Because our qualitative sort of life is centered around how we can align mind, body, spirit, and the emotion in order to be able to be in oneness with ourselves. Thokoza Koko. And that's just touching, because there's so much we can speak on in terms of what we do, and we will have a chance.
I can see. Thank you for that. Very thorough. If we can just, for this moment, take us back to the early days of your spiritual path by sharing a little bit about your upbringing, your religious upbringing or your background, as a young child, your formative years, growing up. And within that, what percentage would you say was Christian or tradition, or did one way clearly dominate? Or
It's always very interesting when we have to sort of look at our spiritual journeys in retrospect. And whenever I teach or I share on a spiritual journey or a spiritual awakening, is that we are inherently spiritual. And whenever I narrate how it is my spiritual sort of journey went, it will sound very structured and with form, but it's in the journey is something that requires for you to always go back, which is why we believe in connecting with our ancestors, abapanzi, abalele, those who have come before, because we understand that we walk on their shoulders. So a lot of our work is from a retrospective lens. So for me, I can say my spiritual journey began even before I was conscious of the fact that I'm here in this world. Because from when I was born, my mom was still pregnant, she started to have dreams about the fact that she was going to have a child and that I was going to be a boy. And whether it was God or whether it was the ancestors, there was a name that was given for her to give to me. And then fast forward to when I'm born, I come back home and I have issues sleeping at night. I'm always crying, I'm always sleeping. Because of that, my mom being at my maternal sort of grandmother's home, my grandmother's sister said to her that there's a need for you to take your son to his paternal home, and because there are certain traditional rituals which need to be done, otherwise the child's spirit will continue to be afflicted. That's why he's not able to sleep or eat. So that was done, and when my mom went to my paternal grandmother's home, my great grandmother was still alive. She was given a place to sleep, and then they took me as a child and they said to her, don't worry, just make sure you sleep with the door open. If we need to come and feed your son, we will come and you will hand him over and you can breastfeed. The following day, my mother was sent to go and sightsee, because we come from a beautiful place from my paternal home, which is in Graskop area, Hlabegisa, where God's window is and the potholes are. Everyone can just check it out. It's really magic. So she was taken to go sightseeing to see all of those sites around there. And when she came back, she found that my hair had been shaved off, but I had stopped crying and I was very present. It's like there was a life force that was suddenly alive within me. One of my younger cousins who was around said to my mom, oh, you know what they did? They took my cousin and they went to the mountain. And when they came back from the mountain, they had cut his hair. And she mentioned that it was all the elder women that had gone. And now growing up, I understand that that was a ritual, Yampabadimo, because I am Pulana from my paternal side. So when a child is born, you do a ritual called Mpabadimo. And what Mpabadimo means basically is that a gifting to the ancestors, or a gifting to the ancestors. So every child goes through a rituals where you are gifted to the ancestors and to God, because in our language, Badimo is the ancestors and Modimo is God. So Mpabadimo is that this is a gift from the ancestors that we must give thanks to the ancestors for having given us, and to Creator Modimo. And within that, your name is, and your future destiny is sort of passed over and prayed over, and there are blessings, there are invocations that are done, entreaties to the divine for this journey of the child. Also, there's a rooting and an anchoring and a grounding in the people where you come from by the doing of the practices. So from there, I grew up going forward, and what my mom always narrates is I was a very perceptive child. So if we were going somewhere and there would going to be some sort of calamity, I would start to cry again. And they told her that whenever your child doesn't want to go somewhere, don't go, because there's going to be something. So there was always a flirtation of a sort of a supernatural, if we could use the word supernatural. But growing up with my mom, whose family comes from a very religious background. At the time they were going to the Alliance Church, but coming also then from my great grandfathers being people who were founding members in the Zionist churches and the apostolic churches. So they were amongst the first families when the Witchcraft Suppression Act happened to actually convert their spiritual gifts to Christian or religious sort of expressions. So I grew up with that being very heavily emphasized. And in all honesty, I love church. Even now, I have no issue with Christianity as a codex to be able to penetrate, a higher form of expression. I don't carry the sort of historical negative context that has had and its impact on the entire world. But that's how I grew up, with church, with prayer, with gospel music, and in very charismatic sort of thing. And that was where my drawing was. So I was always into prayer. And one thing then growing is that I always had an innate understanding of the direction I need to take in life, the direction other people need to take. So I always had people that my parents would call projects, and I was always fixing people. But growing up now and having initiated, I understand that it was my gift as it was growing and imbuing with the essence of who I am. When I got to maybe grade 11, that's when I had a moment of sort of catharsis, because I started to lose all interest in the idea of religion and the Christian paradigm. And I found that moment very, very traumatic for me, because it left me with no other option, because I had not been introduced to the traditional practices, which is why I hadn't continued to mention any sort of other intrinsically indigenous practices in our family upbringing expression. What then happened at the time is I met a lady, Marina Maya, and she was into Eastern mysticism. So she introduced me to, Ayurvedic sciences, introduced me to Buddhism and all of those Eastern mysticisms. And I immediately was drawn to it. And what drew me to it was the understanding of the fact that we always have been, we will return until we have sort of accomplished what it is that we need to realize in this human form. And now that I've initiated, even that cathartic moment is very important, because that is exactly part of what the ancestors come back to do, is they return because there are things, whether from their direct impact or action or inaction, that carry to change and shape the destiny of an entire bloodline or an entire people. So they keep on reincarnating to correct those past mistakes, or to guide, to change the outcomes where there was interference, and so that we can find ourselves back in a point of alignment or in oneness with ourselves. And after, I guess, to go back to the Buddhism, is I practiced and I went into yoga, finished matric, and I went to varsity, and then I lost complete interest in any sort of spiritual practice. I changed completely from the person I was. I used to be a very studious person. I mean, I went to UCT on scholarship. It was at the time the best varsity in Africa. I had very clear directions that when I'm done, I'm going to go, study at Oxford and do my postgrad in Oxford. When I'm done from Oxford, I want to have a bit of international exposure and go maybe work at the UN for 2-3 years in New York, so then I can come back to South Africa. So all of my dreams and goals were very sort of Eurocentric or colonial, because I don't like to sugarcoat things. We're very colonial driven in terms of the constructs which represented self actualization. So when I got to varsity, I became a complete party person. I didn't attend lectures. I didn't find studying very fulfilling. There was always something better to do than going to varsity. And I experienced falling out of myself even for the first time then. Because when my transcript came and I had to do summer school in order to continue the following year, I started to have all of this internal conflicts, because I couldn't recognize the person I was becoming or unbecoming. And from that year of 2009, when I was in first year, up until 2013, there were a lot of sort of shedding of all of the layers that I had constructed around the colonial sort of lens and expression I had decided was what my dreams were, what I was purposed to come here for. So I started to go into exploring things such as meeting people from all over Africa, because I was also very xenophobic. I had a lot of internalized oppression when it came to anything African. I considered Africa dark and backwards. But I went into all of the spaces where my prejudices had pulled me away from engaging with my African nature, until I started to experience what felt like a sort of a schizophrenia within myself, because I felt there were so many different aspects that started to live within me and I couldn't reconcile. And when that happened, I started to think, because we have a pathology in my maternal side that is said to be mental illness, but only now, having answered my calling, do I understand that mental illness and the calling is something that's easily misunderstood, and it manifests in the same way. So I was led to then initiating by having lost around 5 years of my life and desiring for finding what it is that was essentially what I had come here for. And then between the, blacking out, where I would black out and find myself having like had sleep paralysis and walked maybe 2-3 kilometers, sometimes 10 kilometers. There was a lot of nonsensical things that were happening that I couldn't quantify. So it forced me to look into the quality of life and to seek as to what is it that can restore the quality of life. And then everything just started to fall into place. I happened to then meet my Gobela when I went to my first initiation ceremony. And when I then went to their home the following week when they had a ceremony, I just knew inside me. I said to my sister, I'm going to initiate Ukuthwasa, and in Ukuthwasa lana, this is going to be my Gobela, this is going to be my guru. So it was a journey, a journey.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing. And some concluding remarks from you, Tsetso Makubedo. I have to get your Ukuthwasa Makubedo.
Tsetso Ntuthuko Makubedu, Gogo Khanyakude. I believe for me, I'd like to maybe conclude on what you touched upon as to what brought me into the space to want to do the heritage talks and the importance of being a millennial in the digital age. And with this time in the world where there's this grand awakening and a shift where we are recognizing that the way in which we have lived and the systems and the structures, the institutions, and everything around it, inherently there's something integrally wrong because it has informed, the continued repression of people on gender lines in terms of sexual identity and orientation, on racial lines, on an economic lines. We have impacted the world on an environmental level and climate change. All of the structure or the world view which has promulgated, the global identity, something within it has taught us behaviors which make us no longer be in alignment or be able to coexist alongside this world which we are reliant upon. I mean, when we go into things that are spoken of in the tenets of the UN and such as even the World Health Organization, there's an invitation and a call into governments and organizations to look into indigenous knowledge systems as to how they can be answers to contemporary living issues. In all of this, when we then go back into understanding from a historic point of view that colonialism, what has woven us back together when we're separated by the continents, was driven by religion, it was driven by politics, it was driven by monarchies, it was also driven by economic gains. Those were the four tenets of the modern world. It was driven by those, whether it was the missionaries, whether it was the balkanization of the land for the resources that the people had, whether it was an introduction then into shifting away from those traditional indigenous ways of expression or systems of governing into then adopting political ways or adopting sort of Eurocentric patriarchal ways. But there was a shift away globally where the modern thought system or framework removed all of us as a people from what spirituality enshrines. So when we think about what then globalization and modernity and the World Wide Web means, is that we are now integrally interconnected. The separation of borders, of ideologies and everything is irrelevant to our interconnectedness and interdependence as a world, because we eat Chinese, we shop French, we decorate our homes with African art. There's a merger of all of our expressions. This for me is an invitation then for us as a global people to shift our consciousness from, the definitions of economy, of politics, of religion, and of those sort of patriarchal structures, and going back into looking as to our ancestors in all parts of their Aboriginal states, whether it's in Europe, looking at the indigenous knowledge systems that existed in Europe before the promulgation of the witch hunts and the Christian crusades and the whole falling out of the sort of indigenous expression there, understanding how the people who built Stonehenge, how they got to understand astrology and be able to build a structure which is thousands of years old, but which is able to tell time, which is able to be able to also match with the winter and the summer solstices. In the same way as all the way down in South Africa, we have Adam's calendar in Inzalo Yelanga, which is the oldest sundial and in the world. It's older than the pyramids in Stone Age. It's where time was created, if we had to think about time, because a sundial tells time. It also is able to track the movements of the solar and the lunar in all of its occurrences. So those people had an ability to understand what we now call astrology, what we now, look into and understand that it has an impact on in terms of how our seasons changed all of those thousands of years ago. And our focus now in modernity has always been around the systems we have constructed. Whereas when we revisit all of the indigenous people globally, we understood that our ancestors learned by living in alignment with nature. And when we say living in alignment with nature, they tracked the change of seasons. They looked at the animals and how the animals interacted with the land in order to learn how it is to live in alignment. In our modern age, those are things that are called modern terms that are called green economy, where we're shifting to green economy, brands that must give back more than what they take, brands that are all around, how it is they can heal the earth. These are concepts all of our forefathers understood from time immemorial. When we come into, the teaching as to how it is that we interact with the living environment, I mentioned that I am Mupulana. So in our clan, we believe in animal totemism. So our animal totem is a lion, but there are all those in my grandparents who are monkeys. There are those who are leopards. There are those who are elephants. And in that, when those totemism represents that, when we see the spaces where those animals are naturally born in, also where they live, we see a place where divinity lives. We see creator and our ancestors when we see those animals. So from the teaching system of our Pulana cosmology, it informed for every person who understood it to then naturally also then be a nature conservationist, because you understand the importance of always having these totems and the relation it has to do with self and your identity as a people. So for me, we go back into using the heritage talks to decolonize also the idea of religion and spirituality. It goes into understanding that what modernity and religion has done is that in all of our indigenous spiritual systems or belief systems, it came and removed God and left us only with what seemed like fetish or magic and supernatural and ancestral revelry. And for me, it's around understanding that indigenous knowledge systems is inherently spiritual. So in that spirituality, our ancestors act as an intermediary because they've lived in this physical realm and they've also transcended into the spiritual realm, which in our quantum physics is understood as energy always remaining. And I touched upon how we tap and tether into those energies. But our ancestors acting as intermediaries connect us to source. Whether you want to understand that source as the original spark that did the Big Bang, or you want to understand it from a Kemetic perspective of the primordial source, or you want to understand it from the creation story of the Bible where God said, "Let there be light," but there was a divine spark that made everything which is in existence to exist. And all of our indigenous, spiritual expressions have always been around how can we align to those rhythms and cycles of nature, because that original spark created nature. we continued to create the man-made world, the built environment, but nature still remains, and a revisitation to that nature is then an alignment where we'll shift away from things such as capitalism and all of the oppressive systems that I mentioned, which have been an inheritance of colonialism, an inheritance of religion, an inheritance of politics, and going back to a point where it's not around an individual but a collective. Because even in the trying times we're in now with the pandemic, there is a need for us to come together collectively as humanity to be able to carry ourselves through this, if it will not be something that will be the undoing of all of us as a people.